In the Imperium of men, communication is not a convenience. It is lifeblood. Across a million worlds, where cities stretch higher than mountains and darkness drowns the stars, orders of survival flow through the VOX. A soldier's last plea, an astropatha's burning song, a governor's decree, all carried through crackling static and whispered channels that span endless gulfs of space. But in the far future, nothing is safe from corruption. The warp is an ocean of screams, and every transmission cuts across its surface like a blade. To listen is to invite. To send is to expose. Most VOX messages reach their mark. Some do not. On countless hive worlds, civilians gather around battered receivers, waiting for the next command that will decide life or death. But when the voices shift, when familiar broadcasts twist into something else, the people have no choice but to listen. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, even sound itself is a weapon. And sometimes, the VOX does not carry the voices of men. Sometimes, it whispers back. Tarsus 9 was a hive drowning in smog, a continent of iron stacked skyward. For centuries, its people worked, ate, and died without seeing the stars. Orders from the administratum trickled down through the VOX towers, dictating when to work, when to riot, when to pray. But one cycle, the towers went silent. At first, the people thought it was nothing, a storm, a fault, some clog of rust. The streets rumbled with uneasy quiet. Markets closed. The workers looked up, as though silence itself were unnatural. Because it was. On Tarsus 9, silence meant something was wrong. Then came the static. At dusk, from battered home units and rusted public receivers, the first sound broke the hush, a long hiss, filled with faint scratches, as though claws dragged across glass. People leaned close, straining to hear. And within the static, a voice emerged. Faint, genderless, warped by distance. Stay inside, do not look at the sky. The crowd froze. Some laughed nervously, others crossed themselves with the Aquila. But the voice repeated, stronger, layered as though more than one throat spoke at once. Stay inside, do not look at the sky. The VOX had returned. But it did not speak with the tongue of men. The following cycle, the static returned. No official broadcast codes, no administratum seal. Just the voice. At first, most citizens dismissed it. Hive workers were conditioned to distrust rumor, survival meant obedience only to sanctioned orders. But curiosity is a poison, and in the underhive, whispers spread faster than fire in an oxy pit. People tuned their battered VOX sets at night, huddled around the glow of corroded dials. The voice always came at the same hour. Stay inside, do not look at the sky. The phrasing never changed, though sometimes the tone did. One night, it sounded like a child, trembling and afraid. The hive of Tarsus 9 had always thrummed with noise, the constant clatter of industry, the metallic groan of lifts, the wheeze of chem pumps feeding the smog-choked atmosphere. Silence was alien. Silence was threatening. And so, when the VOX began to speak again, the people embraced it. Not all of them. Not at first. But hunger breeds desperation, and desperation breeds faith. The first listeners had died, yes, but their death spread not as warnings but as myth. By the time the second week of silence passed, stories spilled from level to level, that the voice was not poison, but prophecy. that those who died listening had been taken into the machine, carried upward to the throne. That the static itself was a bridge to something greater than the choking hive they knew. The administratum did what it always did, it issued edicts, punishments, floggings. VOX receivers were confiscated, homes set smashed beneath the boots of enforcers. But the people of Tarsus 9 were nothing if not resourceful. For every unit destroyed, 2 more were repaired in secret. In abandoned tunnels, in sealed habs where the air stank of mold and burnt wire, civilians clustered together to hear the nightly broadcast. The voice had grown clearer. It no longer whispered. It preached. Stay inside, do not look at the sky. The stars are not for you. The stars are teeth. The stars are watching. Whole groups began repeating it back, word for word, like a catechism. Some scrawled the words in soot across the walls of habs and stairwells. Others etched them into metal with knives, bleeding on their makeshift altars. The faithless laughed, but the laughter was brittle. For even those who mocked found themselves turning the dials when darkness fell, desperate to hear what the static might say. The first great gathering came on the 15th night. No one planned it. No one spread the word. Yet when the hour arrived, hundreds drifted into the central concourse of level 781, carrying rusted receivers, cracked speakers, and battery-fed sets. They stacked the devices together, wiring them into a makeshift shrine. When the static hissed to life, 1,000 heads bowed. Stay inside, do not look at the sky. The crowd repeated it, their voices trembling in unison. Then came something new. Do not fear the silence. Do not fear the end. The machine carries you, the machine holds you. The machine remembers. Gasps, sobs, cheers, the mob fell to its knees. Some beat their foreheads against the steel floor until blood marked their devotion. Others wept openly, convinced the emperor himself had found a way to speak through the veil of distance. But not all were so convinced. At the edge of the crowd, Enforcer Sergeant Crail watched, his jaw tight beneath his rebreather. He had patrolled these levels for 20 years, and he knew the look in the people's eyes. This was not discipline. This was not faith sanctioned by the ecclesiarchy. This was something else. Something dangerous. When the broadcast ended, silence fell, but not the silence of emptiness. The silence of expectation. Every throat held its breath. Every ear strained for the next word. But the VOX gave nothing more. Until one woman screamed. It was not a scream of pain but of ecstasy. She collapsed to her knees, arms spread wide, her voice echoing like a vessel overflowing. It spoke to me. It spoke through me. I am chosen. Her words ignited the crowd. Hundreds surged toward her, clawing to touch her robes, smearing themselves with her blood as she cut her palms in offering. She laughed, shrieked, convulsed, until her skull burst open like glass under pressure, spraying the front rows in red mist. And still, the crowd praised her. Still, they shouted her name as though she had ascended. Crail's enforcers opened fire. Lost bolts ripped through flesh, dropping dozens in moments. The mob scattered, trampling the weak in blind panic. but the silence that once terrified the hive was gone. In its place came ritual. Night after night, at the same appointed hour, the VOX lit with static and the voice carried its command. And every night, more of the hive listened. But faith, whether sanctioned or profane, is never still. It grows, mutates, demands proof. The people of Tarsus 9 no longer gathered only to hear the message. They began to interpret it. The words were vague, but their hunger for meaning was bottomless. Stay inside, do not look at the sky. What sky? The upper hive. The heavens. The void itself. The machine remembers. Which machine? The hive's rusting core engines. The God Emperor's throne. Each group twisted the words to their need. Some locked themselves in dark habs, fasting until their bodies withered. Others climbed to the highest levels, seeking a sky they had never seen. Some whispered that the static was the Emperor warning them of an enemy within. Others murmured that it was no Emperor at all, but something older, greater, more merciful. And when belief splinters, violence follows. The first blood spilled in the manufactorums. A group of workers refused to leave their VOX-lit chambers. When foremen tried to drag them back to the lines, the listeners, as they called themselves, fought back with cutters and chains. By the time enforcers arrived, 24 bodies were cooling in the ash pits. Sergeant Crail led the purge. His men stormed the hab, cutting down the ringleaders in controlled bursts of lost fire. He had expected resistance. He had expected screams. He had not expected singing. The listeners chanted even as they burned, their voices trembling in perfect mimicry of the VOX. Not a single cry of pain escaped their lips. They died smiling, static frothing from their throats. Crail reported again, suspected warp corruption, psychic resonance, heresy. He demanded the ecclesiarchy intervene. He demanded the towers be purged. Again, his message never reached the upper levels. The cult spread faster than plague. Everywhere, symbols bloomed. Scratched into steel, carved into flesh, jagged spirals of broken circles, crude depictions of mouths without faces, diagrams of stars rearranged into impossible constellations. Some scrawled the phrase, "The machine remembers," across entire stairwells, painted in blood thick as tar. In the underhive, gangs began carrying scrap metal VOX sets like reliquaries, chanting as they marched. Some swore they could tune the static themselves, hearing answers in the hiss. They fought each other for possession of these relics, war spilling through tunnels with blades and pipes. And above, in the spire where the nobles lived, rumors spread that the static had been heard in the palace. That even the governor's court could not escape its whispers. The real horror came not from the cultists, but from the echoes. It began with the children. Parents swore their infants repeated the broadcast before it aired. Toddlers sat in the dark, rocking back and forth, mouthing words in voices too old for their throats. Schools reported mass fits, classrooms collapsing into perfect unison as children droned the phrase. Stay inside, do not look at the sky. Crail's patrols dragged families from their habs, accusing them of harboring witches. But the more they purged, the more the echo spread. Adults began convulsing mid-shift, mouthing words in harmony. Entire work crews froze in place, machines grinding to a halt as hundreds whispered in time with the VOX. Krail began to fear the truth. This was not a cult. This was not mere hysteria. The VOX was not teaching them. It was using them. Then came the night of the first true sermon. The hive darkened at the appointed hour. All work ceased, as if some unspoken signal had been given. Thousands gathered in chambers and tunnels, clustered around their receivers, holding their breath. The static hissed. And then, the voice changed. Blood remembers. Blood carries. Give to the machine what the machine gave to you. Gasps spread through the crowds. Some fell to their knees. Others raised knives. The stars are teeth. They hunger. Feed them. Feed us. Feed yourselves. Screams answered. Not of fear, but of ecstasy. The congregations erupted into chaos as the first sacrifices began. Families turned on each other with cleavers. Children were smothered by parents weeping with joy. Blood pooled in the streets, slicking the rusted floors. Krail and his men fought to contain it. Enforcers stormed block after block, only to find massacres already complete. Hundreds dead. Thousands chanting, their hands dripping red, their eyes glazed white with devotion. For the first time in his career, Krail faltered. Not because of the slaughter. He had seen worse. But because, in the midst of the carnage, his own men began to sing with the crowd. The VOX no longer belonged to the people. The people belonged to the VOX. The hive's towers had always loomed like black teeth, spiking upward into the poisoned clouds. They were relics of a forgotten age, colossal antennae rising from the hive's spine, humming with power long after their makers had turned to dust. To most citizens, the towers were simply there, background, unchanging, like the sky they never saw. But to Sergeant Krail, they had become something else. They were no longer just transmitters. They were sources. The realization came too late. Enforcers dragged a half-dead cultist before him, caught daubing blood around a tower's base. The man's mouth worked like a broken machine, static bubbling from his throat. But in moments of lucidity, he whispered fragments that froze Krail's blood. It isn't coming from above. The towers are speaking. They are mouths. They are open mouths, and we feed them. Krail killed the men himself, one lost bolt to the skull. But the words burrowed deep. That night, he stared at the silhouette of the nearest tower against the smoke-racked sky. Its blinking lights flickered like eyes. The longer he watched, the more he swore the steel structure moved, ever so slightly, like muscle beneath skin. The towers were not machines. Not anymore. The next cycle, reports confirmed it. Entire districts near the towers fell first. Families slaughtered each other in perfect rhythm with the VOX. Corpses arranged in spirals at the tower bases, heads tilted skyward, mouths open as though singing. The air near the spires was thick with ozone and the stink of meat. Krail led a squad into Sector 12, where 3 towers loomed. they found the streets deserted, doors sealed. At first, it seemed abandoned. Then they entered the concourse. The walls were coated in blood, congealed into thick, dripping sheets. The bodies of hundreds lay sprawled in precise circles, every skull split open from within. Not by weapons, by pressure. As though something inside had clawed its way out. And above, from the highest VOX speakers, came a new sound. Not words. Breathing. Slow, labored, vast, like lungs the size of mountains inhaling through rusted metal. The towers heaved with it. For every breath, the lights pulsed, red and wet. Krail ordered his men to destroy the receivers. They obeyed, smashing units, shattering controls. The breathing grew ragged, furious. And then, the static roared back. You. Carriers. You. Carriers. The words bellowed from every speaker, shaking dust from the ceilings. His squad collapsed, clutching their heads, blood pouring from their ears. One by one they turned their rifles on themselves, laughing through their tears. Krail staggered alone into the streets. Above him, the towers pulsed like throats swallowing. The hive was not listening to a signal. The hive was being spoken through. By dawn, the cult called the towers holy. They named them the mouths of the machine, claiming their steel carried the Emperor's true voice. Priests emerged among them, robed in black wires torn from dead units, their skin tattooed with spirals of crude circuitry. Their sermons spread like fire. The machine remembers. The machine hungers. Feed the mouths, and you will be remembered. And the people obeyed. Offerings piled at the base of the towers, food, water, trinkets. Then pets. Then children. Screams rose nightly, swallowed by the steel spires. The towers groaned louder with each sacrifice. Krail tried to rally resistance, but his squads were dwindling. Every patrol returned smaller, soldiers defecting to the cult, or killing themselves after hearing the breath in the static. Even his most loyal men twitched when the broadcasts played, their hands trembling near their rifles. And deep down, Krail knew. It was only a matter of time before he, too, would start listening. That night, alone in his barracks, the static hissed through his personal VOX set. He should have smashed it. He should have turned away. But he didn't. He leaned closer. And the voice whispered his name. The hive had long since stopped pretending to be a city. By the 30th night, it was a wound, raw and festering, where men no longer acted as men but as beasts herded by a voice. Tower 7 was the heart of it. From the shadows of its iron base, the corrupted priests of the cult Mechanicus preached sermons that no longer bore the Omnissiah's name. They spoke with mouths half metal, half flesh, sparks of static hissing from between broken teeth. They were not men. They were transmitters. The sermons were always the same. The machine does not hunger for oil. The machine does not hunger for metal. The machine hungers for blood. At first, even the maddened crowds hesitated. The idea of sacrifice still held weight, even in a world already drowning in death. But hunger had stripped away hesitation, and desperation had left them hollow. A man offered his dog. A mother offered her infant. And when the spire glowed faintly red with the first pour of blood, hesitation ended. The towers drank. Whole blocks competed to offer more flesh. By the 32nd night, the towers pulsed crimson like veins beneath diseased skin. Every alley carried the copper tang of gore, every gutter was painted red. Even the enforcers, who had once kept order in the lower levels, turned their stubbers on their own kin, dragging prisoners to the bases of the spires like offerings to hungry gods. For those few who resisted, silence became survival. Krail's barricade on level 422 was one of the last. A few hundred souls clung to him, laborers, widows, deserters, and a scattering of children who had not yet learned to sing the whispers. They ate fungus scraped from ventilation ducts, drank stale water filtered through cloth, and slept in the shadows of improvised gun nests. Their nights were spent listening to the endless hum of static beyond their walls. Krail tried to preach discipline. He told them to ignore the voice, to plug their ears with wax, to remember that they were men and not cattle. But discipline had limits. On the 35th night, the voice changed. You are food. The stars are teeth. Half the survivors broke. They rose as one, eyes glazed, bodies trembling with hunger and devotion. They charged their own barricades, chanting the words of the voice, desperate to throw themselves at the towers. Krail's guards gunned them down. Blood sprayed across the walls, but the dead wore smiles. Every corpse felt like a failure. Krail buried them himself, whispering words of the Emperor he no longer believed. Yet the towers glowed brighter with each death. By the 40th night, the hive was unrecognizable. The sky above the spires was no longer black but veined with crimson fissures. Shapes stirred in the clouds, vast and shifting, like the shadow of some predator circling above. The air smelled of iron and burnt meat, and every surface seemed slick with dried blood. The towers did not just drink, they sang. When the sacrifices flowed, the static became a chorus. Thousands of voices overlapped, shrieking praises, demanding more. To walk the streets was to hear the hive itself wailing, a cathedral of flesh and wire screaming into eternity. And still, Krail resisted. He gathered his loyalists, a dozen men too stubborn to break, too bitter to worship. They carried explosives scavenged from mining stockpiles, weapons long since stripped of their cereals, and a final oath, to silence Tower 7 or die beneath it. Their march was slow. Every corridor stank of death. Every level echoed with the chants of the faithful. The men walked past butchered altars, past mothers painting symbols on their children in blood, past old men lying down willingly on sacrificial stones. Yet still they moved. As they approached the spire, the voice grew clearer. Not static now. Not distortion. A name. Krail. Every speaker across the hive roared it. Every mouth in the crowd screamed it. Every tower pulsed red as though the blood itself was chanting. The towers knew him. The voice of the hive had seen through him, had tasted his resistance, and now it hungered for his defiance more than his blood. Krail raised his rifle and spat into the dirt. Then come and take me. And the crowd surged forward. The spire rose like a blackened fong, its walls slick with iron veins that pulsed faintly red. Each throb carried through the stones of the hive like a heartbeat, a reminder that this was no building but a living thing that drank and hungered. Krail and the 12 who remained moved through the ruins in silence. Their weapons were few, stubbers with half-spent magazines, lasguns scavenged from dead enforcers, and mining charges packed in a satchel heavy across Krail's shoulder. None of them expected to survive. That was never the point. The streets ahead were a sea of worshippers. Hundreds of zealots knelt at the spire's base, their chants carried on broken voices. They swayed as though caught in a wind, arms raised, throats vibrating with the same static that hissed from the tower. Some bore crude wires stitched into their flesh, others gouged their own skin in spirals of blood. Varen, the youngest of Krail's band, whispered what the others already knew. Too many. Krail's voice was gravel, stripped of fear. Not enough to stop us. At dusk, they struck. Their rifles cracked, lost fire seared the dark. The first line of zealots fell shrieking, their bodies collapsing like wheat before the scythe. For a heartbeat, the chants faltered. Then the mob surged forward. Not in panic, but in joy. They ran to die, screaming Krail's name, eager to pour themselves into the pit of blood. The barricade collapsed under sheer weight. Zealots flung themselves onto bayonets, clawed at rifles, bit with bloodied teeth. The street became a slaughter ground. Varen was dragged into the crowd, his screams cut short as the faithful tore him limb from limb. When his blood splashed across the spire's base, the veins along its walls brightened, glowing red as if fed directly by his sacrifice. Krail spat and pushed forward. Each step left corpses in his wake. His men followed, fewer with every block. Their boots slipped in gore, their ears rang with the static roar now filling the air, louder with every breath. At the base of Tower 7, they saw the pit. A wound in the stone, filled with blood so thick it steamed. Zealots dragged captives forward, slitting throats in ritual rhythm, their bodies cast aside like husks. The liquid shimmered as though alive, and the tower drank, its walls pulsing with gluttony. Above the pit stood the priests. They were no longer men. One's jaw was replaced by a brass speaker that crackled with static as he intoned blasphemies. Another's spine was a tangle of cables plugged directly into the spire. Sparks arced from their bodies, and their eyes glowed with a red fire that was not human. When they saw Krail, they spoke as one. The resistor comes. The crowd howled his name. Not in rage, but in hunger. Krail hurled his first grenade. The blast scattered zealots, blood spraying across the pit. The chanting wavered, replaced with screams. His men opened fire, carving a brutal path forward. For every step gained, one of them fell. Sarek was gutted by a chainsword, his entrails spilling into the pool. Yura was dragged down, his skull cracked on stone, his body trampled beneath the mob. By the time Krail reached the spire, only 4 men still stood. Up close, the spire's voice was unbearable. It was no longer static but a living roar, vibrating inside his skull. It clawed at his thoughts, breaking words into fragments, filling his head with whispers of surrender. Krail. It spoke his name again and again, each time louder, until his teeth rattled and his vision blurred. The tower did not want his death. It wanted his defiance. Krail pulled the satchel from his shoulder. His hands trembled as he armed the charges. The countdown's faint beep was swallowed by the thunder of the mob. The priests stretched out their arms. Feed. The crowd surged forward. For a heartbeat, Krail looked up. Through the haze of smoke and blood, he thought he saw the stars, not distant suns but vast, jagged teeth gnashing in the void. The hive was not beneath the heavens. It was inside a mouth. He pressed the detonator. The explosion ripped the night apart. Flame blossomed around the spire's base, tearing through stone and steel. The pit of blood ignited, erupting into crimson fire that licked the sky. The blast flung zealots screaming into the air, their charred bodies raining down on the mob. The spire shuddered. Its veins dimmed, its roar faltered. For a moment, hope bloomed in Krail's chest. Perhaps the tower could bleed. Perhaps it could die. But the hope lasted only a breath. The spire straightened, unbroken. Its wounds glowed brighter, its hum deepened into a monstrous growl. From the flames stepped the priests, their bodies charred but still alive, cables sparking as they raised their arms. The tower pulsed once, brighter than ever. The entire hive seemed to scream his name. Krail. He had not destroyed it. He had offered himself to it. The resistor was never the end. He was the sacrifice it wanted most. When the smoke cleared, the hive was no longer silent. It sang. The explosion that should have broken Tower 7 had instead awakened it. The spire's wounds glowed brighter, veins crawling upward like rivers of fire. The static no longer hissed, it howled, 1,000 voices layered into one endless scream. The faithful pressed their faces into the blood-slick stones, licking the flames, laughing as their skin peeled away. The priests danced at the base, their cables sparking as they shouted through ruined throats. Above them, the tower pulsed with such intensity that the very sky seemed to ripple. Krail staggered to his knees. His ears bled, his ribs cracked, and his hands still clutched the empty detonator. Around him, his men were gone, burned, trampled, consumed. The crowd had left their bodies where they fell, each corpse another gift to the spire. For a heartbeat, he thought of surrender. He could walk into the pit, let the tower drink his blood, end the nightmare with one final act of obedience. But even in ruin, defiance clung to him like a second skin. He spat red onto the stones. "No," he whispered. The spire answered. "Yes." The hive itself began to change. Buildings buckled as though their steel bones had softened. Walls sagged into grotesque shapes, windows stretched like mouths. Streets cracked, bleeding rivers of black filth that steamed as it touched the air. The people screamed, not in terror but devotion, throwing themselves into the muck, smearing it across their faces. The static became a chant. It rolled through the city in waves, rattling metal and bone alike. The mouth opens. The mouth opens. Krail stumbled through the chaos, clutching a broken rifle. Every step was a battle. Every breath tasted of copper and ash. The hive was no longer stone and steel, it was flesh, pulsing and groaning as if alive. Above, the sky tore. The cracks that had lingered for weeks split wide, bleeding crimson light. Beyond them, he saw not stars but vast shapes shifting in the void, jaws of impossible size, serrated and endless, gnashing against reality. The hive was a tongue. The towers were teeth. And the galaxy itself was about to be devoured. At Tower 7's base, the priests spread their arms. Their voices were amplified by the spire until every syllable thundered through the hive. One more. One final offering. The crowd turned as one, thousands of eyes locking on Krail. The resistor. They surged toward him. He fired wildly, lost bolts cutting down the first wave, but it was like trying to hold back an ocean. Hands clawed at him, teeth snapped, bodies pressed so close he could barely breathe. They wanted not to kill him but to carry him, to lift him up and hurl him into the pit as the tower's crowning sacrifice. Krail fought like a beast. He shattered skulls with his rifle butt, tore throats with his hands, screamed until his voice broke. Still, they came. For every zealot that fell, 10 more grasped him, dragging him closer to the spire. At the edge of the pit, he saw it. The blood shimmered, thick and alive, swirling into shapes that almost resembled faces. Mouths opened within the surface, gasping, whispering. The pit was not a pool. It was a throat. And it waited for him. In that moment, Krail laughed. The sound was ragged, broken, but true. He had no bombs left. No men. No hope. And yet still he laughed at the tower, at the priests, at the hive itself. If they wanted his blood, they would choke on it. He dragged a knife from his belt, the last weapon he possessed, and drove it deep into his own chest. Blood poured freely, hot and defiant. The crowd froze, stunned. The priests shrieked in rage. Krail staggered forward, his vision narrowing, his breath gurgling in his throat. With the last strength in his body, he hurled himself into the pit. The blood swallowed him whole. For a heartbeat, silence. Then the hive screamed. The spire convulsed, its veins bursting, fountains of blood spraying across the streets. The priests exploded in showers of gore, their bodies unable to contain the backlash. The crowd wailed, tearing their own flesh in agony as the static collapsed into raw, animal howls. The pit boiled. Faces shrieked from its surface. Hands clawed upward, grasping at nothing. And from deep within, something vast shifted, as though Krail's sacrifice had not ended the hunger but awoken it further. The cracks in the sky tore wider. The teeth beyond them pressed closer, gnashing. The hive shook violently, towers toppling, streets splitting open as if the entire city were sliding down a throat. And then came the voice. Not static. Not many voices. One. We hunger. Krail's death did not silence the towers. It crowned them. His defiance had been swallowed, transformed into fuel for something far greater. The hive was gone now, a carcass devoured from within. The people still living writhed in ecstasy, their flesh reshaping, merging with steel and stone. they were no longer human. They were choir. Above, the void mouth opened wide. Its teeth shone like stars. Its breath reeked of burning worlds. And the hive, still singing, slid willingly into its jaws. The last sound was not screams, nor prayer, but the endless hum of static fading into silence. And then there was nothing. The transmission begins with static. Not unusual for the ruins of Hive Epsilon 7, the city had been silent for centuries. What is unusual is that the static breathes. Each hiss rises and falls like lungs drawing air. Through it, voices bleed. Some are clear, some fractured. All are desperate. The tower sings. Blood for the mouth. He laughed as he fell. The voices overlap, hundreds upon hundreds of them. At times they speak as individuals, at times they unify into one single tone. A fragment of imagery bleeds into the recording, descriptions of buildings melting, streets flowing with blood, the sky breaking open. No picked feed was active, yet the VOX imprint carries the impressions as though they had been seen and seared directly into the device's memory. Most haunting is the name that repeats, again and again, beneath the screaming. Krail. 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 The tone shifts near the midpoint of the recovered file. The voices no longer sound human. The words warp, deepen, grind together until each syllable tears at the ear. We hunger. We hunger. We hunger. At this point, the recording destabilizes. The VOX coils melted under strain, fusing into slag. Yet still, on the final channel, one whisper remained. It was faint. Almost drowned beneath static. But analysis confirmed the words. It is never silent. Not here. Not anywhere. Then the transmission ends. The official record lists Hive Epsilon 7 as destroyed by structural collapse during a seismic event. No survivors were ever recorded. The ruins remain quarantined by decree of the Inquisition. Unofficial reports whisper otherwise. Pilgrims to the site claim the air still hums faintly, like a distant choir. Some swear they hear laughter woven into the wind. Others say the ground itself shifts, pulsing, as though the hive were not dead but dreaming. One account, smuggled out of a sanctioned exploration detail, describes a survivor. A child, eyes burned white, speaking in a voice that was not their own. The mouth opened still. And we are all inside. The child died within the hour, body rupturing into black fluid that corroded all it touched. The Ordo Hereticus maintains strict silence regarding the incident. But among the scattered records, one phrase surfaces often, as if scribbled in the margins of forbidden tomes. Voices in the VOX. A warning. A remembrance. Or perhaps merely an echo that refuses to fade.